Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. Welcome. My guest today is Dr. Christopher McDonald. He is the senior political scientist at Lincoln Land Community College and a military historian who regularly lectures at the Illinois State Military Museum. He won the Pearson Master Teacher Award in 2001. McDonald has published a number of articles and book chapters on a broad range of topics. In 2015, he published a book-length collection of letters from the First World War, which he researched and annotated. He is an expert in the study of Great War weapons and artifacts, which will be the topic of discussion today. Welcome, Dr. McDonald.
Hi, Rob.
Thanks for doing this. This is really interesting. I think your topic here is really cool as well.
Yeah, it's a little strange. You know, I'm a political scientist by training and background, but this sort of topic, I think, brings together all sorts of really interesting ideas. I mean, including political ones about colonial expansion, but also, chemistry and industrial development and commerce, as well as the sort of military stuff.
Dr. McDonald, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have an English ale, Bass & Company's Pale Ale. It is known as the world's first pale ale, having been brewed since 1777. By 1877, the brewery started by William Bass was the largest in the world. Trying a Bass is like taking a sip of history hundreds of years in the making. If you would like to try this historic British ale, it is available at the Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits in Quincy. Remember, you can suggest a feature beer for a future episode by subscribing to the podcast wherever you get your podcast, liking the History A Go-Go Facebook page, and leaving a comment. World War I is often presented as the start of the modern beginning of new technology, but Dr. McDonald, you say that it marked the high point of the most widely used piece of technology, the bolt-action infantry rifle.
Right. You know, when we talk about World War I, we generally talk about all the new things that it brought, right? Internal combustion engines used, barbed wire, machine guns, and all, the advent of all of that. But one of the things that interests me in particular is that it did mark the high point of what had been, sort of the dominant weapon, and to some extent remained the dominant weapon, with a couple of notable exceptions through the Second World War, and that's, as you said, the bolt-action infantry rifle. And if you think about it, to the extent that bolt-action rifles are still in use today in specialized roles, sniper and marksman roles and stuff, the weapons that are used are basically identical in design, if not some of the materials, to the weapons that were introduced just prior to the First World War. So when you look at the Mauser designs and then the designs used by Britain and the United States, those are in essence identical in every major form today as they were more than 100 years ago. So I think it does mark a high point in that.
Well, the British experienced issues which led them to a redesign of their weapons, and so did the United States. Could you speak to what the British experienced in South Africa and then what the United States experienced in the Spanish-American War?
Yeah, I mean, you can sum it up in one word, really: Mausers. In both the Boer War in South Africa and the Spanish-American War, The United States troops were mostly armed with the Krag-Jorgensen rifle, a decent design, but a fairly old design and a little bit complicated. And some still had single-shot Springfield rifles. The British had a very good design, the magazine-Lee Enfield, but it was a long version of it. And what they found in the field was that they were, in some senses, outgunned by the forces that they were facing. And I think this is probably demonstrated by the American experience at San Juan Hill, where a small force of about 750 Spanish regulars was able to significantly delay and inflict very heavy casualties on a much larger force of American soldiers. And what they were facing was versions of the 1893 or 1895 Mauser, which fired a smaller caliber, higher velocity round, smokeless powders, so higher rates of fire, more accurate, and it led both the British military and the United States military to take a long, hard look at how they equipped their soldiers, and in fact, it led both of them to replace the weapon that they had. The Americans actually, the United States, began the process and it ended with the 1903 Springfield, which is a fairly famous and well-known rifle. The British modified their long Enfields, eventually adding a facility to allow clip loading or charger loading, so you could load the magazine rather than one bullet at a time. You could strip off 5 rounds into the magazine, or ultimately 10 in the Enfield. And so what you're seeing is some really quite significant shifts there based on that experience. What's really interesting, and to the best of my knowledge, this happened independently, is that both the United States and the United Kingdom settled on an intermediate length rifle. So I'm talking about the physical length of the rifle. Previously, what armies had done is had a long rifle for infantry, on top of which a significantly long bayonet was added, in part because they were still thinking that lines of infantry would need to be able to repel cavalry. So you needed a long stick. And then for artillery and cavalry, a short carbine length. So you had 2 versions of most weapons being issued. What the United States did with the 1903 and what the British did with what was going to become the SMLE, the short magazine Lee Enfield, was go for an all-arms rifle, an intermediate length rifle. And, obviously that simplified production in a number of different ways. But at the time, it was really fairly controversial because there was thought that shorter barrel meant less accuracy. We now know with the smokeless powders and smaller calibers that's not true. But also there was concern about, well, what are you going to do when they face cavalry? The idea that this was being talked about at the same time that machine guns was being introduced is a little bit complicated. But you see what happens with both the Springfield and the Enfield. They put a 17-inch long bayonet straight out of the 19th century on the tip of them. So we have this really interesting sort of nexus of experience and development.
Well, it wasn't, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think Theodore Roosevelt, they initially had some sort of modified, almost like a jabbing stick. It wasn't even like a true bayonet. And then Roosevelt stepped in and said, no, we need the traditional long bayonet. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, the Springfield, the very early 1903 Springfields had, it's a spike, like a rod bayonet. Now, in some ways, that's relatively modern. And of course, bayonets are fascinating and horrific things, if you look back through. So the Civil War bayonets were those sort of, most of them, some of them had blades, but most of them fitted on the pattern 53 Enfield were big, long spikes, triangular cross-section spikes. They were mirrored in the 19th century British bayonets on the Martini Henry and things like that. And then blades were introduced. But the Springfield, so the Krag had a blade bayonet, for example. The first Springfield bayonets were indeed back to spikes. Now, it's interesting because the French continued on their Lebel rifles to use a big, long spike bayonet, a sort of 17-inch long knitting needle looking thing. And that's what the first Springfield bayonets were. But I'm to be honest, I'm not sure to what extent it was the influence of Roosevelt, but certainly those were replaced rapidly with by 1903 with the more traditional blade knife bayonet. What's interesting is if you skip forward to the Second World War, for example, so Britain continued to use a version of the Enfield in the Second World War, and their bayonets had been reduced to what is in essence a 9-inch nail. I mean, literally just a 9-inch spike that goes on the end. So some of these things go in cycles, it seems, in terms of what's most appropriate. The soldiers in World War II, the British soldiers, hated the spike because it was no good for anything other than being a bayonet.
That's what I was going to say as a soldier, because I've spent, 27 years in the Army in one capacity or another, and I would say that would be the usefulness of the bayonet, not only because if you're fixing bayonet, things are not good, especially in modern warfare. So it's really a useful tool. And if it were just a spike, that would reduce the usefulness of it.
Yeah. And I mean, in the First World War, I mean, you see that. So in the 19th century, it was actually quite common for bayonets to have along the spine, the back, a serrated saw edge. Now, those look horrific and gruesome, and of course they are, but the purpose of the serrated saw edge was not to, it was sort of a byproduct that would inflict horrible injuries. The purpose was to allow pioneers and engineers and regular soldiers to flip their bayonet over and saw wood and cut down things for barricades and, useful things. In the First World War, the British actually registered official complaints with the Germans, which is a bit of an odd thing to do when you've got poison gas and barbed wire and the horrors of the First World War. But many German bayonets at the start of the war had this saw edge on the back. And it led to, by the middle of the war, the Germans removing those saw edges, actually grinding them down, or all new produced bayonets not having them. So, you're exactly right. There were many other uses for the bayonet than what was talked about. As a collector of these things, one of the things that generally amuses me is if you look at the pommel of bayonets, the hilts of bayonets, it is clear many of them have been used for hammering things open and breaking things in ways which probably weren't intended by their designers.
Soldiers don't do that, Dr. McDonald.
No, I'm sure not. Absolutely.
Going back to the Spanish-American War, was it as simple as after, let's take San Juan Hill, for example, which I think might have been Kettle Hill, but either way, you take that charge. Is it as simple as Americans picking up the Mauser and then taking it back to the United States and said, this is something that we need to incorporate into our design? Is it that simple?
Well, the Mauser design had was being, to put it in terms that, are more our era, the Mauser in many ways was the AK-47 of the beginning of the 20th century, or the late 19th century. Mauser was selling their designs all over South America, to Spain, to Turkey, obviously Germany, to Sweden. This design was incredibly successful as both as a weapon, but also as something that was being sold, and so it was is. I mean, if you go and buy a hunting rifle today, the vast majority of them are going to be basically a Mauser design. And so, clearly the impact of the Mauser and the small caliber bullet, most of them were chambered. The Spanish Mausers, the 1893s and 95, 96s, were chambered for a 7mm bullet, which, small, high velocity, quite a lot of powder behind it, but actually a small projectile. So accurate, rapid, relatively low recoil, all of those things. So, I mean, I think the soldiers felt the effect of them, but I think weapons designers at, the Aberdeen proving grounds, or here in Illinois at Rock Island and places like that, were quite aware that, hey, this is a thing. This is something we need to look at. And then, of course, the stories from the soldiers came back of how they had been outgunned.
Just to verify what they already knew.
Yeah. I mean, I think to say one caused the other, or I think these things are generally a process. I mean, there is a connection with what's going to happen later on in the First World War, which is really interesting. That the British decided the Enfield design probably is up there with the Mauser in terms of longevity. And all of that. But originally, it was a single-shot weapon. It had a magazine, but you had to load it one at a time from the top. What was added was this, what the British call a charger system, which we know as a stripper system, a stripper clip, where you have your ammunition in 5-round clips. You slide it into the top and then thumb it down and load the magazine and throw the spring clip away, or if the sergeant major's around, put it back in your pocket, I suppose. But so you strip it down in there, and that allows for much more rapid reload. So what the British did was take their existing design, put a charger bridge over the action so that could happen, and shorten the rifle to make it much more handy. But otherwise, the design stays the same. The United States completely redesigned the rifle around a Mauser design, with several infringements of Mauser's patent, which they had to pay for. But here's the sort of the thing where some of this begins to come together. At the same time that Britain was doing this, at the beginning of the 20th century, 1907, between 1903 and 1907, so absolutely simultaneous to the US doing it, Britain also began working on a new Mauser-based rifle. Now, this was quite a long process, and it eventually came to fruition in 1913 with a proposed new rifle for the British Army. This was a Mauser design. It was called so it used the Mauser bolt action. It was British design, but used the Mauser bolt action. It was called the Pattern 13 rifle. And what's interesting about this was that Britain was developing it and also developing a new cartridge. The cartridge was a .276 inch or 7mm cartridge, but it was much closer to what we might today recognize as a Magnum cartridge. So it had a lot of powder behind a relatively small projectile. And the plan was that this was going to be the new British rifle. I mentioned that it came to sort of first production, at least for trials rifles, in 1913. Obviously, war broke out in 1914, and the idea of introducing a brand new rifle and a new caliber, as opposed to the standard .303 British, meant that wasn't going to happen. They actually had some problems with the cartridge. It was very, very hot, and they found that it was causing excessive barrel wear. The problem was with the cartridge, not with the rifle design. So Britain puts that on hold and goes with the short magazine Lee Enfield, which turns out for your listeners who've seen 1917 or watched the wonderful They Shall Not Grow Old documentary, it's sort of the emblematic rifle of the First World War. It has that very distinctive muzzle shape with the project. So Britain went with that as their standard rifle,
and that actually worked out really well because of the close proximity. When you get inside, it's almost like clearing a room when you're in the trenches, and having a shorter rifle would be more useful.
Right. I mean, in the confines of a trench, that shorter length, and in fact, all the other armies just started issuing their carbine length ones in much higher numbers. That's what happened in the French army. It's what happened in the German army, where they issued many more carbine length rifle, carbines, 98 carbines, rather than the full rifle as the war went on. But Britain was ahead. Also, the advantage that the Enfield had, or in these sorts of circumstances that the Enfield had, was, although there are arguments about the forward locking bolt system and all of that, it had a 10-round magazine.
That's the one thing I noticed as such a great advantage, that 10-round magazine. Did that, when it was implemented into the field, did that have a positive impact?
Well, the original, I mean, it's complicated. Most people are going to say yes, but the original magazine, Enfield, of the Boer War, had a 10-round magazine, but it had to be reloaded singly. And so, you've got 10 rounds that you can fire, but then it's going to take you quite a long time to put those 10 rounds back in again, because you have to pull them out individually and push them in to the magazine. With the advent of the charger clip, you can do that very quickly. And the British Army, whereas the US Army really emphasized marksmanship in the pre-World War I period, the British Army had a big emphasis on marksmanship, but also on rapidity of fire. And there, the 10 round, that does seem to have been sort of ahead of the game in lots of ways, because the 10 rounds was an advantage. Yes, absolutely. But it's difficult to say that the 10 round on its own brought the advantage. The 10 round plus the ability to reload it quickly clearly brought an advantage.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the sort of a follow-up to this, or a continuation to this, which lets us get into some of the other. So Britain put this new rifle on hold and just said, we can't do it now. The war's going ahead. But Britain very quickly faced a shortage of weapons in the conflict, massive wastage early on as they're driven back towards the coast. Plus, there's a giant expansion of the army, obviously with volunteers coming in and then later conscription. And so Britain was casting around for second-line weapons. And what they ultimately decided to do was rechamber this Pattern 13 rifle, the Mauser design, the experimental design, for their standard 303, and place contracts with American arms manufacturers to produce them. And so the Pattern 13 got renamed the Pattern 14, now using the standard 303 round, and contracts were let with Remington, Eddystone, and Winchester in the United States to produce this weapon for the British. Now, clearly, this is sort of politically quite interesting because, at this point, 1914, 1915, the United States is neutral, and, Wilson is arguing for neutrality, and yet the United States is producing large numbers of weapons. And if I just run down the list for you, they make rolling bock rifles and Berthier rifles for the French. They make a version of the Mauser for the Belgians. The Westinghouse and others make Nagants for the Russians. And Remington, Winchester, and Remington Eddystone make rifles for the British. You can see what's in common there. That, as soon as the war starts, United States manufacturers, as commercial concerns, are selling weapons to the French, the Belgians, the Russians, and the British, all of the Allied side, which, is an interesting phenomenon in the basis of when we're talking about a neutral country.
Now, not to deviate too far from the topic, but in Wilson's perspective, is he just saying, well, that's where the contracts were placed? If the Germans want to place a contract with Remington or Winchester, they're free to do it as well. They're just not doing it. Is that his philosophy, or is there a true bias towards those countries?
Wilson's really interesting, and there are people who are much more expert in Wilson than I. Wilson is clearly an Anglophile in lots of different ways.
So publicly, he would probably say that, but personally, it might be a different story.
I think this is largely commercial. I think while the United States is politically neutral, and of course it's very complicated when you've got a country with massive immigration into it from Central Europe, many of whom are from Germany or locations which are part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? So World War I is very, very controversial in the United States because of this. You have large Irish immigration into the United States, where, of course, Britain, and particularly at this period, is not necessarily flavor of the month, particularly amongst immigrants who've left Britain, left Ireland. So, I think declaratory policy and declaratory positions are one thing, but when there's money to be made, these contracts are going out big time. And this is where I don't know if we call it luck, fortune. It certainly wasn't really planning, but this has a massive impact in terms of rifles when the United States enters the war. So the story with the Pattern 14, this British rifle, is by the time that Remington, Winchester, and Remington Eddystone get their act together and get production going, British rifle production has caught up. So most of these Pattern 14 rifles that the United States produces and ships to Britain, they don't make it to France. They're used for second line training, or interestingly, they go straight into store. They do come back out in 1940 and are used largely to arm the Home Guard in Britain. Dad's Army, that they are largely armed with these Pattern 14 rifles. But the real consequence is what happens on the other side of the Atlantic in the United States. These contracts for the British rifle are ending at the beginning of 1917. That's when the last deliveries take place. And so just as these contracts to the British are ending, the United States is entering the war, and you have this massive, huge expansion of the U.S. military, right, with the draft and with the creation of the American Expeditionary Forces and the expansion and all of that. And the United States simply doesn't have the weapons. They just don't. At the beginning of 1917, the United States only had 600,000 Springfield 1903 rifles. And we're talking about a military which is going to grow from a couple of 100,000, 1916, to over 4 million by the end of the war, of whom nearly 2 million are in Europe. So obviously there is a massive shortfall. The Springfield was a very accurate rifle, somewhat fragile and somewhat touchy. It had a rather complex sighting system that was quite easy to damage or to knock off. But above all, it used relatively old production techniques. It was hard to produce. Many of the manufacturers, including Rock Island, had issues with steel quality and hardening, and had just had production problems. So, for example, the Springfield rifle, I said there were 600,000 in 1917. By 1918, at the end, U.S. stocks of the Springfield were still only around 900,000 or 1 million. So they'd only really added 300,000 to the stocks. So what was it that armed a giant chunk of the American Expeditionary Force, plus many of the people training at home? And the answer is a version of the British Pattern 14, which the United States rechambered again for the 30-06, the 30 caliber round, the standard U.S. round, and set Remington Winchester and Remington Eddystone to produce within the United States. And one of the things about this design is that makes it really modern. It's really the only 20th century design of all of the ones we've talked about. It was designed for mass production, and it had a couple of other features which you will recognize. So, for example, it had a receiver-mounted PEEP sight, so a ring and post sight. So you had a preset battle sight, which was pre-zeroed at 300 yards, and then you had an adjustable longer range sight, but it used a PEEP and the post at the front as opposed to the older barleycorn or leaf sights, right? So that meant for target acquisition and for sight radius and all of those technical things, it was a very, very modern rifle. And it was also a rifle which was designed for mass production. It had a simple shape of the stock, for example, that was one piece that the action dropped into. And so, just for comparison, the United States had obviously no Model 1917 rifles available in August of 1917 when the contracts ended, and by the end of the war had 2.3 million of them.
That advantage of the zero and the sight picture and having the battle sight zero, to me, that's an incredible advantage. But I was going to ask you, when you researched some of the soldiers and you got into some of the letters and stuff that I know you have done, did the soldiers have a preference between, and I'll just focus on the American soldiers right now, between the Springfield 1903 and that new Pattern 17?
Yes, they did. And lots of them, particularly the regulars, pre-war regulars, lots of them speak of favoring the Springfield. It was shorter and handier, and so there's that. It's sort of interesting that the Pattern 14, the Model 1917, is longer and a bit heavier. They had trained on that old sighting system, and so where you find preferences expressed in letters, you do often see preferences expressed for the Springfield. And in part, I think that is, because this is what soldiers trained with, and they don't like anything to change, right? I mean, that's common to all of us. I think also that you get lots more surviving commentary on things like that from regular soldiers. The conscripts who knew nothing else, the M1917 really proved itself in combat as incredibly rugged, incredibly accurate. There was one weak point on the design. There was the ejector spring was a flat stamped piece of steel, and they were somewhat prone to breaking. There was a fix for it, a replacement part, but that was something that the design evolved. But the sight and the sight picture on the M1917 is clearly superior. I mean, it's a modern receiver sight, and I mean the testament to the superiority of that design is with the 03A3 Springfield, the World War II continuation of the 1903 Springfield. the main difference of which was it placed a receiver-mounted peep sight on the Springfield. So, but yeah, I mean, your point is well taken, that where there are expressed views, the U.S. Army testing, both after the war and before, during looking at battle reports, makes no difference. And if you look at the production figures and the final government claims at the end of the war, so the U.S. Statistical Survey of the War says that, quote, American troops were armed with rifles that were superior in accuracy and rapidity of fire to those of either their enemies or their allies. I think they're wrong in the rapidity of fire, because I think the UK Enfield action is a faster action than the Mauser action, but certainly in terms of reliability and all of that, they were. So it is, just to pick up on something that you'd mentioned earlier, there was actually one advantage that the Model 1917 had over the 1903, which directly comes from the change of caliber. The British .303 round is fatter and is a rimmed round. So the magazine well on the Patton 14 held 5 rounds. When it was redesigned for the 30-06, it actually holds 6. So you have a 1-round advantage. Now, the rounds were supplied in 5-round strippers, so you could charge the magazine, then top it up with 1, and then, of course, put 1 in the chamber. So at least theoretically, American troops who had the M1917 went into battle with 7 rounds immediately available rather than 6 in the standard rifle. If you've got 1 in the chamber and a full magazine.
Right. I was going to ask you, now this is, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So the famous event with Sergeant York. What weapon?
I knew we were going to get to this.
I'm a soldier in the U.S. Army. I got to mention Sergeant York. So, what weapon did he use?
Well, the Hollywood movie has him with a 1903.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say, I knew that Gary Cooper used a 1903.
Right.
But
the Hollywood
sure.
movie, I'm not in public going to join this argument where I can be quoted and held to it, because, to be honest, I have read hugely lengthy online arguments about this.
So this is controversy. So I just brought.
Oh yeah, this is hot stuff, and this is not something where I am. No, it really is. It's one of those, amongst rifle collectors these days and weapons historians and all that. There's always this discussion about what's the best rifle, right? Now. I'm not a very tall guy, and I'm British, and to me, the short magazine Enfield is clearly the winner. I find Mausers with their straight bolt quite uncomfortable to shoot, and I have to break my sight picture to take it down each time I reload, whereas with the Enfield I don't. There is that. As you've intimated, the American soldiers appear to have really liked their 1903 Springfields and talk about its accuracy. And clearly, as the Germans continued with a version of the 98K all the way through World War II, and it wasn't supplanted, on any scale at all by a semi-automatic weapon, that was, something that was an incredible design. The arguments rage over what was best. And so I think really the argument about Sergeant York is really an extension of those sorts of arguments. The way to decide it, I suppose, is to look at what his unit was armed with and read his letters. There's a Sergeant York museum. I'm sure they have an answer to this or weighed in on this down there in Tennessee. I don't know. The aphorism is, in terms of looking at the different rifles, that the Americans built a target rifle, the Germans built a hunting rifle, and the Brits built a battle rifle.
That's a pretty good breakdown. The units that used the 1903 were generally your active duty or your standard units, and then those that got called up by the National Guard and so forth normally used the pattern 17. Is that kind of a good way to look at it?
I think actually, I think so. Now, the first troops here's a thing for you. The first U.S. troops that paraded in London in 1917, engineer units. What's really interesting, first of all, it's interesting because those units are it's the first time you have a foreign army parading through London, for a long, long time. But they're actually armed with Krags. The engineer units that went over, the first units to arrive in Britain, very early elements of the American Expeditionary Force had Krags. So, they were regular units, but they were engineers. They were designed to be doing other things, so they didn't have the frontline weapons. But I think, generally speaking, what you've said is true, with the slight modification that quite a lot of National Guard units had 1903s because they had deployed down to the Mexican border in 1916. So, for example, some of the Illinois units definitely had 1903s when they went overseas. But generally speaking, National Army, the divisions that were put together with conscripts, trained with and went with M1917s. Yes. Now, there are also interesting pictures of U.S. troops training with Russian Nagant rifles. Because, as I mentioned, the United States was producing rifles for Russia. Those contracts were canceled and deliveries stopped in 1917 with the Russian Revolution. And so there were large numbers of 1895 Mosin Nagant rifles produced by Westinghouse and Remington in the United States. So many unit, you can find quite a lot of pictures, and for some reason quite a lot of pictures of units out west training with Nagant rifles. And there's a sort of a postscript to that as well, that quite a lot of the troops, American troops that were deployed to Russia in 1919, the Polar Bear Force, nominally to protect Allied supplies at ports, but actually operating in support of the white forces against the communists with Nagant rifles. So, the sort of, there is a continuation of that story too. But generally, yes, National Army M1917s, original Army. But of course, that all got mixed up as divisions were skeletonized and mixed around.
So the period between the wars then, between World War I and World War II, is there any innovations, or did they just revert back and kind of sit on the laurels and no major innovations during that time period?
This is beginning at least to move out of really my area of knowledge. Clearly there are innovations. And so the Garand and the beginning to introduce semi-automatic weapons and submachine guns, as short-range, small caliber, pistol caliber weapons. Clearly, the Garand and, well, to some extent, the Johnson, and at the very end of the First World War, the Browning automatic rifle or the Bar. Those begin to point the way towards modern semi-automatic and automatic weapons, right? You get the very first submachine guns being experimented with at the end of the First World War. Those with things like the Thompson and German developments, the MP28 and things like that. Those become significant interwar weapons developments. In terms of the bolt-action rifle, the Germans go to a shorter length, so their standard infantry rifle in the Second World War is the 98K, which is a Mauser 98 carbine length, right? Carabiner with a K in German, so you get that. The United States, as I mentioned, whilst they're developing the ultimately incredibly successful Garand, also update the 1903 Springfield, and the update is to put a receiver-mounted peep sight on it to make it the 03A3. The British take the Lee Enfield, the short magazine Lee Enfield design, redo it for mass production. So they put a slightly heavier barrel, a slightly different stocking system, and a receiver-mounted peep sight on it, and that becomes what's known as it's introduced in the late 30s and becomes the standard British infantry rifle, actually up through Korea, which is the number 4 rifle. The Russians become the Soviets, don't do very much at all. Their World War II rifle is, again, a slightly shorter, but not very much, and slightly resighted Mosin Nagant that becomes the 9130 rather than the 1891. And towards the very end of the war, 1944, the Russians make huge numbers of a carbine length version of that. So that's the M1944. But the real change comes with the semi-automatic rifle. And then by the end of World War II, with the introduction of what we would recognize today as quote-unquote assault rifles, where the Germans introduced one, the United States have introduced one relatively early, the M1 carbine, a carbine length firing a sort of slightly enlarged pistol cartridge. The Germans introduced one with the MP44, and ultimately, of course, the Soviets introduced the Simonov, the SKS, and the sort of AK form of families. So that's your whole picture there. But in terms of my area of any knowledge, the bolt action rifle, the bolt action rifles that the United States is deploying, things have changed slightly today, but certainly through the end of Vietnam and up through a Remington 700, for example, the sort of thing that police departments and SWAT teams use versions of, and all of that, is really that Mauser action. It's not fundamentally different. There are experimental ones around it, and I can hear all the real firearms experts listening to your podcast gnashing their teeth and saying, what about? But I'm talking sort of on the big picture, that no, apart from materials and obviously industrial capacity to make things much more precisely with computer-controlled machining and all that, the design of a high-end bolt-action rifle today would be instantly recognized by soldiers of the First World War. They might marvel at the high-density plastic stocks and the fancy optical sights that we put on them, but the mechanism of the rifle, I think, would be recognized in the hands of a German soldier, a British soldier, an American soldier in the First World War, for sure.
So when they develop this type of technology for the rifles, is it top secret so they don't want to even share it with the Allies? So not to get, like, as you mentioned, you're not really an expert in World War II weaponry, but for the Grand, it seems like it's such an advancement. Does the United States share that with any of the Allies, with the British?
Well, I mean, they sold Garands to the Allies in some numbers. Britain didn't develop a mass use semi-automatic rifle until the 50s. There are patents on various designs, and I mean, once you put things on the battlefield, they're not top secret, right?
Right.
But because they fall into the hands of the enemy, and then the enemy take them apart and figure out what's going on. But I think one of the things is that knowing how it works is one thing. Tooling up to mass produce it is not something that can happen very quickly. And so, with the exception of extremely protracted conflicts, that's perhaps not a concern. I mean, there were things. So, for example, I think I'm right in saying that the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, which has a very long service in U.S. history, it's a model 1918, but I think the numbers that were deployed to the frontline soldiers, one was restricted because it was a new weapon, but two, I believe I'm right in saying that there was some hesitation by the Americans to deploy those as soon as they had them, and until they were available in sufficient numbers for the sorts of reasons that you were talking about. There was another interesting development, which was something called the Peterson Device. And the Peterson Device, or Pedersen, I think it's actually a D, Peterson Device, which was an insert for the M1903, which basically you replaced the bolt with what was in essence a semi-automatic pistol, and then inserted a pistol caliber magazine up through the bottom, and it made the 1903 Springfield a semi-automatic pistol firing weapon. The idea, at least in theory, was that the soldiers would, have their full caliber weapon while they're defending trenches, and when they go into an attack and are jumping into enemy trenches, they will take out the bolt from their rifle, insert this Peterson device, clip in a magazine of pistol caliber rounds, short range pistol size rounds, and then use it, as you were talking about, for that close combat trench weapons. It essentially becomes a rapid fire semi-automatic weapon. It was they were produced. They were produced in reasonably large numbers in late 1918, but never made it to use. They were tested and used at Rock Island and places like that, but they never made it to France. They're really scarce these days. There are very few of them in existence. They do have one at the museum at Rock Island, but what was made in huge numbers and still survives and are relatively easy to find are the cases for the webbing cases for them, which there was a special case that you put your 1903 bolt in, and then there was a magazine case that held, I think, 4 of these pistol rounds, magazines, and the Peterson device itself. Those are, show up all the time around the place, and they're invariably dated 1918 or 19. So there were some sort of interesting innovations. It never went into, it never saw action, however.
So my last question for you, Dr. McDonald, is, so if they produce all of these weapons and then the war ends, what happens to all those weapons? Millions of weapons. Okay.
Yeah. So in the British case, the Patent 14s go into store. Some get sold to the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and stuff in the interwar. Some get supplied to India. But most of them are sitting in warehouses until 1938, 1939, when war looks imminent, in which case they're pulled out, degreased, cleaned up, and issued as second-line weapons. In the United States case, the M1917 went into reserve. They were used by Marine units and various other units very early in World War II. Quite a number were bought by Britain in 1940 1940 and then supplied under Lend-Lease by the United States to Britain and Canada prior to the United States entering the war. So the United States had large stocks of M1917s, which they pulled and sold out. And they were also supplied post-war to, I think, Denmark and Norway, and they were supplied to the government sides in the Greek Civil War. They were supplied in various forms to Israel. So generally speaking, they're held as reserve. I think the M1917, if I'm remembering correctly, was officially declared obsolete in the US and sold off. Large numbers went into the civilian marksmanship program and were sold on, the open market in 1947. So Britain disposed of its stocks after the Second World War. So, these huge numbers are produced. You asked about innovation in the interwar period. To some extent, obviously, you have the global financial crash, the Depression, and all of that. Militaries don't get to develop new weapons when you've got millions of weapons in supply and you're facing this giant financial crash. So lots of them sit in storage and are dusted off and used. The United States supplies M1917s to the Philippines, for example. And so the Philippines Armed Services have those in their fight against the Japanese and all of that. So they're sold on once they are not frontline weapons for the United States and for Britain, sold on down the line. The one thing that I mentioned the commerce and diplomacy neutrality stuff. The thing that goes at the beginning in some ways is chemistry. And this happens at so sort of this prompts almost all of the things we're talking about, and that is the development of smokeless gunpowder. And so smokeless gunpowder, so the first rifle developed to use smokeless gunpowder as opposed to adapted to smokeless gunpowder is the French Lebel in 1886. And that's developed to use smokeless. Smokeless powders make a huge difference on the battlefield. Muzzle velocities increase, therefore ranges increase, and you no longer get huge clouds of smoke every time you fire the weapon. So it suddenly becomes much more important to wear drab and camouflage and olive and field gray and all of these things. And rapidity of fire goes up and accuracy over range goes up. So that chemical development in the late 19th century of smokeless gunpowders, which develop higher muzzle velocities and don't obscure the battlefield in huge rolling clouds of the fog of war, that has a spurring effect to all of the rifle designs that we might talk about and the changes that we see going forward. And that's something which sort of, because it's chemistry and it's laboratory and it's not front and center in everybody's mind, it's very, very significant. If you compare images of battles in the late 19th century for mid to late 19th century American Civil War battles with First World War and the differences that we see there. So yeah, I think that's a significant element.
Well, thank you, Dr. McDonald.
Yep. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun.
I'd like to thank my guest today, Dr. Christopher McDonald. If you would like to purchase his book, it's available at the gift shop at the History Museum on the Square in Quincy, located at 4th and Main. The feature brew was the historic British ale Bass & Company Pale Ale, the very first pale ale in the world. The best way to listen to the podcast is actually go grab the featured beer and join the conversation. Remember, you can suggest a feature brew. Just subscribe to the podcast, like our Facebook page, and leave a comment. If yours is selected, you will win a $10 gift card and a shout out on the next episode. The music was provided by the great Bones Fork. They're working on a new album right now, so new music is coming soon. Thanks for supporting us, and join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.